an entire community. Gone. Namaygoosisagagun, Collins First Nation. Homes, buildings, the infrastructure a whole community leaned on for generations, burned to ash by a single fire that had a number instead of a name. Thunder Bay 36. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. Chief Helen Pavola says her people were told not to worry, told the fire wasn't a threat. Days later, they watched their homes disappear. That same fire is now the largest wildland fire in the recorded history of Ontario. Over 315,000 hectares. Let me put that in terms you can actually see. That's more than 5 times the size of the entire city of Toronto. Not a neighborhood, the whole city. 5 times over, swallowed by one continuous burn. And it didn't just edge past the old record. It smashed it. The previous all-time provincial record was set just last year, the Red Lake 12 fire in 2025, at roughly 196,974 hectares. Thunder Bay 36 didn't inch past that mark. It doubled it. A record that stood for one single year. Obliterated. Now stack the rest of it. As of July 24th, 2026. There are 139 active wildfires burning across northwestern Ontario alone, part of roughly 177 across the entire province. And of those 139 in the northwest, exactly 30 are officially listed by the Ministry of Natural Resources as not under control, not being held, not observed, not contained, out of control. 30 separate blazes, right now, that no crew on the ground can put a boundary around. 2,861 people forced out of their homes, most of them from remote First Nations communities. Families loaded onto aircraft and buses, moved to reception centers hundreds of kilometers away, places like the Fort William Gardens Arena in Thunder Bay. An arena floor turned into an emergency shelter for people who, days ago, were living on the land their families have known for centuries. And if you're sitting somewhere far from all this, Toronto, Detroit, New York, anywhere south of the fire line, you already felt it. On July 15th, the smoke rolled south and turned Toronto's sky a sick yellow gray. For a stretch that day, Toronto recorded the worst air quality of any major city on the entire planet. 2 days later, on July 17th, Detroit clocked an air quality index of 518. 518. That's not unhealthy. That's a number that tells millions of people to shut their windows and stay indoors. This fire doesn't stay in the boreal forest. It travels. It crosses borders. It ends up in your lungs, whether you've ever heard the word Namaygoosisagagun or not. Good morning, everyone. This is your Ontario wildfire briefing for Saturday, the 25th of July, 2026. And I'm going to walk you through all of it, carefully, region by region, with the real numbers and the real names. Because the story you're being told right now is dangerously simple. And it's wrong. Here's what you're hearing. It rained. Localized heavy rainfall moved through the fire zones over the past few days. Fire behavior, according to the ministry, has gone minimal. So the assumption spreading across social media, across dinner tables, across half the news feeds in the country is the obvious one. Rain fell. The fires must be dying. The crisis must be winding down. Time to breathe easy. I want you to hold on to that thought. Because that assumption is the most misleading part of this entire event, and by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why 30 fires can still be raging out of control after the sky opened up and poured. There's a reason the Ministry of Natural Resources refused to downgrade these blazes even after the rain. There's a reason a fresh evacuation alert went out on July 24th, after the rain, for the Saginaga Lake area, driven by extreme fire behavior from a blaze that has a name on both sides of the border. And there's a reason the very storm that dropped that water may have made things worse, not better. That's the first thing I need you to keep in your head. Rain came. The crisis didn't leave. We'll get to exactly why. Here's the second thread. and it's the one nobody saw coming when these fires first sparked in the dry brush of the Northwest. This environmental disaster, the smoke, the ash, the burned communities, has crawled straight into the middle of a full-blown trade war between two of the largest economies on Earth. The President of the United States looked at the smoke drifting across his border and turned it into a weapon. 50% tariffs. On Canadian wine. On cement. On hockey sticks. Justified, out loud, by wildfire smoke he called poisoning American air. And Canada's Prime Minister stood at a podium and said, in effect, we're ready to hit back. How does a forest fire in a remote provincial park end up dictating the price of goods crossing an international border? How do two world leaders end up arguing about smoke, and I'm not exaggerating this, while sitting together at the World Cup final? Hold that one too, because the gap between what was said in public and what was actually signed on paper tells you something ugly about how this whole thing really works. Two threads. Two questions I promised to answer. Why the rain didn't save anyone, and how a wildfire became a tariff. But before any of the politics, before the numbers game between capitals, I want to keep us grounded in what this actually is. It's a fire season that Canada walked into already exhausted. After 2023, after 2024, after the record-shattering 2025 season, the resources, the crews, the aircraft, the water bombers were spread paper thin before a single 2026 spark ever landed. Then came the heat. Then the dry forest floor. Then the lightning. And in the span of days in July, blazes like Thunder Bay 36 in the Atikokan cluster didn't just grow. They exploded. The fire that took Namaygoosisagagun ignited on July 12th. By July 13th, one day later, the entire community was fleeing for their lives. That's how fast this moves. That's the speed we're dealing with. And that speed is exactly why the comforting story about the rain falls apart the moment you look underneath it. So let's go where the fire actually is. Let's look at what the ground crews are staring down right now, what that thunderstorm on July 23rd really did, and why minimal fire behavior on paper does not mean this thing is anywhere close to finish.start with the paradox that trips up almost everyone watching from a distance. Rain fell across parts of northwestern Ontario these past few days. Real rain. Enough to knock down the flames you'd spot from a highway. Enough that the Ministry of Natural Resources called fire behavior minimal. And your gut says exactly what mine did. Good. It's over. The sky opened up and put it out. That's the illusion. And the boreal forest doesn't care about your gut. Here's what actually happens when a mega fire like this one meets a downpour. The flames on the surface calm. The smoke thins. But the fire isn't only on the surface. In the boreal, the ground itself is fuel. Layers of peat, decomposed needles, root systems, dried organic matter packed down over decades. It burns slow, and it burns deep. A fire like Thunder Bay 36 sinks its heat down into that material and keeps smoldering underground, sometimes for weeks, completely indifferent to whatever rain hits the top layer. The M&R said it plainly in their July 24th update. Even when fire behavior looks minimal, large wildland fires can stay classified as not under control for a long time, because it takes time to make sure the entire perimeter is actually contained. Read that again. The entire perimeter. Now think about the size of that perimeter. Thunder Bay 36 is mapped at over 315,000 hectares. 5 times the size of Toronto. You could soak the middle of that fire in a monsoon, and it wouldn't change a thing about the edges. Because the edges run for hundreds of kilometers through terrain, with no roads, no easy access, no way to walk a hose line along every meter of it. Crews aren't fighting one wall of flame. They're chasing a boundary the length of a small country. And every single kilometer of that boundary has to be checked, dug out, cooled, and confirmed dead before anyone can call it held. That's not a weekend job. That's a job measured in weeks. In some cases, months, rain buys a little time. It doesn't buy containment. And then there's the part that makes the "it rained" where Fine's story fall apart completely. The storm that rolled through the fire zones on July 23rd wasn't a gentle soaker. It was a severe thunderstorm system. It brought wind gusts up to 90 kilometers an hour. Think about what wind does to a fire that's smoldering underground and creeping at the edges. It fans it. It lifts embers off the surface and hurls them across containment lines. A perimeter crews spent days building can get jumped in a single afternoon when the wind comes up like that. So the same storm that dropped water on the region also handed the fire a weapon. There's more. That storm carried lightning. Active, striking lightning. Straight into a region that's been baking through the driest, most volatile conditions of the year. And lightning in a boreal forest in late July isn't weather. It's ignition. Every strike is a potential new fire. So picture the absurdity of it. Rain falling on one side of the equation, fresh ignition sources dropping out of the same sky on the other. That's why nobody managing this response is exhaling. The storm didn't end the crisis. In some ways, it reloaded it. Now here's the reveal I promised you, and it's a big one. On July 24th, the MMER reported something that hadn't happened since July 2nd. 0 new fires starts in the previous 24 hours across northwestern Ontario. 0. For the first time in more than 3 weeks, the region went a full day without a single new blaze igniting. That's real. That matters. After a stretch where the Northwest was lighting up faster than crews could even count them, a clean 24 hours with nothing new is the first genuine sign the front edge of this thing might be slowing. But, and this is the whole point, 0 new starts doesn't mean 0 fire. The massive uncontained perimeters are still active. 30 of these fires are still listed as not under control. You can stop new fires from starting and still be standing in front of one of the largest wildland fires in the history of the province, watching it smolder. Both things are true at once. That's the reality crews are living in. You can actually see the split in the official response, region by region. On July 25th, today, a restricted fire zone was officially lifted for northeastern Ontario. That's the province quietly admitting conditions have eased enough in the east to let people breathe a little. No such luck in the northwest. There, the ban stays locked in place. No open air burning, no campfires, permits suspended, the whole thing. Because that's where the 30 out-of-control fires are still burning. The map tells you everything. One half of the north gets a small measure of relief. The other half is still holding the line. And the line keeps moving. On July 24th, authorities issued a fresh evacuation alert for the Saganaga Lake area, driven by extreme fire behavior from the Fort Francis 13 fire. That's the blaze known on the American side of the border as the Little Knife Fire in Minnesota. A fire that doesn't recognize the international boundary any more than the smoke does. Extreme behavior, days after the rain, triggering new alerts. If you needed one more piece of proof that a downpour didn't close this chapter, there it is. People near Saganaga Lake are being told to be ready to leave. Right now, on short notice, in the same week the headlines were talking about rainfall. Let me slow this down, because behind every one of these numbers is a person who's lost something. As of late July, these fires have displaced 2,861 evacuees. 2,861. Most of them from remote First Nations communities. People who couldn't just hop in a car and drive to a relative's place a few towns over. Many of them ended up in reception centers, like the Fort William Gardens Arena in Thunder Bay, sleeping on cots in a hockey arena, hundreds of kilometers from home, waiting on news about whether there's even a home to go back to. And for the people of Namaygoosisagagun, that answer already came, and it was brutal. Chief Helen Pavola of Namaygoosisagagun, the Collins First Nation, described what her community went through, and it's the detail I can't get out of my head. She said her people were initially told not to worry. Not to worry. And then Thunder Bay 36 came through and consumed their homes. Imagine being handed reassurance one day and watching your community burn the next. That gap, between you'll be fine and the fire at your door is the human cost of moving too slow against something that moves this fast. It's why her name is now attached to some of the loudest calls for accountability coming out of this disaster. So hold both of these truths at once. Zero news starts on July 24th, the first hopeful data point in 3 weeks, and a chief describing the ashes of the homes her people were told not to worry about. That's the shape of this crisis right now. A flicker of progress on one side, wreckage and fresh evacuation alerts on the other. The rain didn't settle it. It complicated it. And that complication is about to reach a place you'd never expect a boreal wildfire to reach. A trade war, a tariff threat, and a confrontation at the World Cup final. Here's how a fire in Wabakimi ended up on the desk of the President of the United States. July 15th. The smoke that had been choking northwestern Ontario rolled south and parked itself over Toronto. For a few hours that day, according to the Swiss monitoring platform IQ-Air, Toronto held the worst air quality of any major city on the planet. 2 days later, July 17th, Detroit clocked an air quality index of 518. Let that number sit for a second. 518. Anything over 300 is classified as hazardous. The reading where health officials tell everyone, not just the vulnerable, to stay indoors. Detroit blew past that by more than 200 points. And the smoke didn't come from Michigan. It came from a fire burning northeast of Wabakimi Lake. That's the moment this stopped being a Canadian story and became a border story. July 19th. Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump were sitting together at the FIFA World Cup final in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Two heads of state, watching the biggest match on earth. And according to Trump's own account, the talk turned to the haze. He said he told Carney, and I'm quoting him here, "You got to stop these fires from coming in and poisoning our air." Then he floated the idea that Canada should pay damages. Or face tariffs. He wasn't bluffing. On July 20th, Trump signed Section 338 proclamations for 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. 50%. On wine, on cement, on hockey sticks, the everyday exports that keep whole towns employed on both sides of the line. And publicly, he tied it to the smoke. He called the haze an atrocity. He accused Canada of poisoning American air through bad forest management. Slow down here, because the rhetoric and the paperwork don't match. Read the actual White House proclamation signed on July 20th, and the word wildfire isn't the legal hook. The official justification cites discriminatory trade practices, grievances over autos, over dairy, over alcohol. The smoke was the megaphone. The tariffs were the deal Trump already wanted. He grabbed a genuine environmental catastrophe, one that displaced nearly 3,000 people, and bolted it onto a trade fight that was already brewing. Both things are true at once. He said one thing at the podium, he signed another on paper. And the gap between them? That's the whole game. Canada didn't blink. On July 24th, Mark Carney stepped in front of the cameras and drew a hard line. If those 50% tariffs come into force on August 19th, Canada is prepared to hit back. His words, "There's a full range of things that we can do in that regard. Everything's on the table." Everything. That's a prime minister telling the president that retaliation is loaded and ready. Two countries that trade more than $1 billion a day, staring each other down over a plume of smoke from a forest most Americans couldn't find on a map. And while that fight plays out in Washington and Ottawa, the political heat back home is climbing just as fast. Premier Doug Ford is the one taking direct fire now. Indigenous leaders are demanding a public inquiry into how his government prepared for a season everyone saw coming. Because remember, this wasn't a surprise. Canada limped into 2026 wrung out by 3 brutal seasons in a row. 2023, 2024, 2025. The Red Lake 12 fire had just set the provincial record last year at roughly 196,974 hectares. Everyone in that room knew the province was dry, understaffed, and exhausted. Then Thunder Bay 36 lit up and swallowed that record whole. Ontario NDP leader Merritt Stiles hasn't softened it. She's accused the Ford government, flat out, of lying to Ontarians about the funding and the equipment given to wildland firefighters. That's not a polite policy disagreement. That's an opposition leader saying the government misled the public about whether the people on the fire line had what they needed. Meanwhile, Jill Dunlop, Ontario's Minister of Emergency Preparedness and Response, is carrying the operational weight, overseeing the evacuation of nearly 3,000 residents, standing up reception centers, keeping the whole displaced population moving. And underneath the politicians, there's a detail that tells you everything about how thin the resources are stretched. In Uppsala, rural volunteer firefighters aren't rolling out in fire engines. They're fighting brush fires with pickup trucks, standard pickups, modified with donated with 1,000-liter fire skids handed out by the disaster charity Global Medic. Water tanks and pumps bolted into truck beds, because the provincial system has nothing left to give them. That's the ground truth beneath the tariff threats and the press conferences. A guy in a pickup with 1,000 liters of water, holding a line the province can't reach. So let's go back to where this started. Namaygoosisagagun, Collins First Nation. A community that was told not to worry, and then watched most of it burn on July 13th. Go back to Thunder Bay 36. That single monster now mapped at over 315,000 hectares, more than 5 times the size of Toronto. The largest wildland fire in Ontario's recorded history. Then the rain came. On July 24th, for the first time since July 2nd, northwestern Ontario logged 0 new fire starts. The northeastern restricted fire zone got lifted on July 25th. Real progress. I won't pretend otherwise. But hold it against the other number. 30 fires still burning. Still classified not under control. Their perimeters too vast for a downpour to finish. An evacuation alert fresh on July 24th for Saginaga Lake. Ford under inquiry pressure. Carney loading retaliation. Trump's tariffs waiting for August 19th. And 2,861 people still sleeping far from home. Rain does not put out a megafire. It buys a breath. That's it. I'll be back with a full update tomorrow as the numbers shift and the August 19th deadline gets closer. If this helped you make sense of it, hit like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so the next briefing finds you. For live evacuation orders, trust the Ministry of Natural Resources directly, not the rumors. Look after each other out there.